Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
Being one of the quieter kids in school, I mostly kept to myself, focusing on my studies and my small group of friends. But this one boy had been making my life difficult since 4th grade, always finding ways to pick on me about everything from my glasses to my second-hand textbooks. That day in 7th grade started like any other. I wasn't feeling great because I was on my period, but I had my trusty cheetah print pouch with me, the one with all the essential supplies a girl needs during that time of the month. I'd gotten it from my mom when I first started my period, and it had become something of a comfort object. I was sitting in math class trying to focus on equations while dealing with cramps when I realized my pouch wasn't in my pocket anymore. My heart started racing. Losing that pouch would be a nightmare. When I went back to my previous classroom after lunch, this girl who sat behind me in English noticed me looking around anxiously. She asked if the pouch on the table at the front of the room was mine, mentioning that she had seen me with it earlier. I felt such relief washing over me and thanked her profusely. I was about to grab it when my longtime tormentor decided to pipe up. He was sitting with his usual group of followers, probably looking for his daily entertainment at someone else's expense. He claimed that the pouch belonged to his sister. I turned to look at him completely baffled. His sister was in 9th grade and had never once stepped foot in our classroom. I insisted that it was definitely mine, but he kept arguing, claiming his sister had lost it that morning. So I challenged him. If it was really his sister's pouch, then he should know what was inside it. He sat up straighter, clearly thinking he had me cornered, and started listing off random items like keys, a school ID, money, and chapstick. I could feel my patience wearing thin. Years of his bullying had built up to this moment, and somehow, this ridiculous situation gave me the courage I never knew I had. I offered to show him the contents, reiterating that it was mine. I held the pouch out to him, maintaining eye contact. He grabbed it with this triumphant smirk on his face, probably thinking he'd caught me in a lie. The whole classroom had gone quiet, watching the scene unfold. He unzipped the pouch and his face went through about 5 different expressions in 2 seconds. First confusion, then realization, followed by embarrassment. But being the bully he was, he tried to save face by walking around to his friends, showing them the contents and mockingly announcing that I was carrying diapers. But instead of feeling embarrassed, I felt strangely powerful. Maybe it was the absurdity of the situation, or maybe I was just done with his nonsense. I corrected him, explaining that they were actually pads, not diapers. I went on to explain, as if talking to a toddler, that unlike diapers, which were for babies who couldn't control their bladders, pads were used by people who menstruate. I even offered to explain what menstruation was, since he seemed confused about the difference between baby supplies and feminine hygiene products. The classroom erupted in laughter, but not at me, at him. His face turned bright red. I pushed it further, offering to draw him a diagram or suggesting we could ask the health teacher to give him a special lesson about female biology. Someone in the back of the class joined in, shouting that maybe he needed to go back to 5th grade health class. He practically threw the pouch back at me and slumped into his seat. The teacher walked in right then, wondering why half the class was still giggling. From that day on, not only did he never try to take my things again, but he also seemed to actively avoid making eye contact with me in the hallways. The girl who had originally pointed out my pouch became one of my closest friends after that. We still laugh about the day I gave an impromptu health lesson to the class bully who thought he could embarrass me with my own period supplies. I've lived in this neighborhood for over 20 years, long before it became part of a homeowners association. My late wife and I bought this house when we were newlyweds, and we poured our hearts into making it our home. After she passed away 5 years ago, I decided to honor her memory by maintaining the house exactly as she loved it. The trouble started when our quiet street got incorporated into the newly formed Crystal Lakes Homeowners Association 3 years ago. Most of us older residents voted against it, but we were outnumbered by the newer homeowners who moved into the recently built McMansions at the end of the street. The HOA president, a retired businessman who lives in the biggest house on the block, has been a nightmare since day one. He's made it his personal mission to enforce every minor rule with an iron fist, especially targeting those of us who lived here before the HOA. Last month, I decided to repaint my house. The original beige color had faded badly, and I chose a warm yellow shade that my wife had always wanted. I checked the HOA guidelines, and while there was a list of recommended colors, there wasn't anything specifically prohibiting my choice. I figured I was in the clear. The morning after I finished painting, someone was pounding on my door at 7 a.m. The HOA president announced himself loudly, demanding I open up. When I asked what the emergency was, he launched into a tirade about the color of my house. He demanded to know if I'd lost my mind and called the color atrocious. I told him it was yellow and asked what the problem was. He became even more agitated, shouting about how this wasn't an approved color and that I was bringing down property values with what he called an eyesore. When I challenged him to show me where in the guidelines it specifically prohibited this color, he could only sputter that it wasn't on the approved list. I pointed out that the list merely said recommended colors and that recommended didn't mean mandatory. He stormed off, red-faced and muttering. 2 days later, I was working from home when I heard a commotion outside. The HOA president was there with a small construction crew and an actual wrecking ball mounted on a crane. My neighbors were starting to gather on their lawns, phones out, recording everything. I rushed outside and demanded to know what he thought he was doing. He gave me an ultimatum saying this was my last chance to agree to repaint what he called a monstrosity to an approved color, or he would take matters into his own hands. When I told him he'd lost his mind and couldn't do this, he shouted back that he would, adding that the neighborhood had standards before I decided to turn my house into a banana. The crane operator was looking increasingly uncomfortable and mentioned that he had been told there were permits for this work. The HOA president just yelled at him to start the crane and take down what he called an eyesore. By this time, several neighbors had called the police. We could hear sirens approaching. I warned him that the police were coming, but he just shouted back that they could come, claiming he had every right to protect property values. 3 police cars pulled up and 6 officers jumped out, clearly not expecting to deal with a wrecking ball in a suburban neighborhood. An officer ordered everyone to freeze and demanded to know what was going on. The HOA president started ranting about property values and aesthetic violations, while my neighbors chimed in with their recordings of his threats. The police quickly figured out who the problem was. When they found out he had lied to the construction company about having permits and had actually stolen the crane company's information from his son's construction business to book the equipment, they arrested him on the spot. Turns out impersonating a legitimate business to rent heavy machinery and threatening to destroy someone's house is pretty illegal. While he was being led away in handcuffs, his wife came running out of their house, screaming that this was all a misunderstanding. She tried to argue that they couldn't arrest him because he was the HOA president. The officer had to explain to her that being HOA president didn't give him the right to destroy property. I couldn't resist suggesting that maybe she should paint their house yellow too to make it a matching set. The whole neighborhood watched as he was placed in the police car. The crane company quickly sent someone to retrieve their equipment, and by evening the story had spread to every house in the development. The HOA board held an emergency meeting that night and voted to remove him as president. They also clarified the rules about house colors. It turns out my yellow house was perfectly fine all along. His replacement, one of my longtime neighbors, made it her first order of business to send out an apology letter to all residents about the regrettable incident. The former president ended up being charged with multiple crimes, including making terrorist threats, attempted vandalism, and fraud for lying to the crane company. He took a plea deal that included mandatory anger management classes and had to sell his house because the terms of his probation wouldn't allow him to serve on any HOA boards. meaning he couldn't live in any HOA community in our state. He moved to a non-HOA neighborhood across town. Ironically, his new next-door neighbor has a purple house with lime green trim. I never expected to be flying back to the Midwest so suddenly. My grandmother's passing hit our family like a thunderbolt. She had been perfectly healthy just days before. Living on the West Coast meant I was somewhat disconnected from my extended family, but my grandmother and I had always maintained a special bond through our weekly video calls where she'd share stories about her garden, and I'd update her on my life in the city. When I got the call from my father, his voice cracking as he delivered the news, I immediately booked the first flight I could find. The following days were a blur of tears, hugs, and shared memories as our family came together to celebrate her life. The memorial service was beautiful, filled with touching stories and surrounded by stunning floral arrangements. My grandmother would have loved it, being the dedicated gardener she was. After the service, I noticed this gorgeous plant arrangement that reminded me so much of her garden. My aunt, seeing me admiring it, insisted I take it back with me to the West Coast. She softly told me that my grandmother would have wanted me to have a piece of her garden, and I couldn't agree more. I had experienced flying with plants before, so I wasn't concerned about Transportation Security Administration regulations. The security check went smoothly, and I made my way through the terminal, pulling my carry-on suitcase with the plant arrangement carefully balanced on top. I spotted a gift shop and decided to browse for a quirky, Midwest-themed t-shirt for my girlfriend. Something to bring a little lightness to what had been a deeply emotional week. As I approached the counter with my selection, the store clerk's expression immediately caught my attention. She had this condescending look that made my skin crawl. With a smug expression, she commented that she had never seen anyone carrying a plant through the airport before. I explained that I had brought plants through security before and that it was actually pretty common. I reached for my wallet in my athleisure pouch, trying to keep things cordial despite her attitude. Her next comment, however, made that impossible. She mockingly asked if it was some kind of emotional support plant that I needed for flying. Her voice dripped with sarcasm and something in me snapped. The grief, the exhaustion, and now this unnecessary rudeness. It was too much. I looked her dead in the eyes, my face completely neutral. In a steady voice, I told her that this wasn't an emotional support plant, but rather a floral arrangement from my grandmother's funeral, who I had buried just 2 days ago. The smug expression vanished from her face so fast it was almost comical. She turned bright red and started stammering, trying to backtrack by commenting on how beautiful the plant was. I agreed with her assessment but didn't stop there. I told her that my grandmother would have loved it, explaining that she was a gardener who had taught me everything I knew about plants, including how to treat both them and people with respect. I paid for the t-shirt and walked away, leaving her standing there in uncomfortable silence. When I made my way to my gate, I could still feel her eyes on my back. Maybe it was petty of me to add that last comment about respect, but sometimes people need a reminder that their clever remarks can have real impact on others who might be going through difficult times. What made the encounter even more satisfying was what happened next. As I sat at my gate waiting to board, I noticed an elderly couple admiring the plant from a few seats away. The woman eventually approached me, commenting on how lovely it was. When I shared its story and my grandmother's love for gardening, she teared up and shared memories of her own mother's garden. We spent the next 30 minutes exchanging stories about our gardening-loving relatives, and she even gave me some tips on how to keep the arrangement thriving longer. Later, as I walked past the gift shop again to get to my boarding gate, I caught a glimpse of the clerk. She was being much more pleasant to customers now, and when she saw me, she quickly looked away, clearly still embarrassed. The plant now sits in my apartment window, thriving in the morning sun, just like my grandmother's garden always did. Every time I look at it, I think of her smile and her endless love for growing things. I've had severe motion sickness for as long as I can remember. Cars, boats, planes, you name it. I've probably thrown up on it. My parents have tried everything: medication, pressure point wristbands, ginger supplements, but nothing really helped. I even got sick on a paddleboard once, which my older sister never lets me forget. When I was 10, my parents had accumulated enough airline miles to take us on a dream vacation to England and Scotland. Being from the United States, this was a huge deal for our family. The first few days in London were amazing, despite getting a bit queasy on the London Eye. Then came the flight to Scotland. We booked with this budget airline to save some money. The plane was tiny, probably the smallest commercial aircraft I'd ever been on. From the moment we took off, I knew this wasn't going to end well. The turbulence was constant, making the plane bounce around like a toy in the wind. I kept my eyes closed, trying to focus on my breathing, but my stomach was doing somersaults. My mom kept checking on me, asking if I was okay. I could only respond with a groan, telling her I didn't feel good. The landing was the worst part. The pilot kept hitting the brakes in this jerky stop-and-start motion that made my stomach lurch every single time. By the time we finally stopped, I could taste the fish and chips I'd had for lunch coming back up. My mom quickly tried to get help, calling out to the flight attendant and explaining that I needed a sick bag immediately. The flight attendant dismissively told us that they don't provide those on their flights. When my mom pleaded to let us move to the front because I was about to be sick, the flight attendant just looked at us with this condescending smirk, like she'd heard every excuse in the book. She rolled her eyes and told us everyone needed to exit in order, with no exceptions. I was clutching my stomach, begging her to let me through as I felt like I was going to throw up. She just responded sarcastically, saying she was sure I would, and that we needed to wait our turn like everyone else. I tried my best to hold it in, but as we slowly shuffled down the aisle, I could feel it rising. We were still several rows away from the exit when I couldn't hold it anymore. I pushed past the people in front of me and sprinted toward the door, but I didn't make it in time. What happened next was pure chaos. Remember those fish and chips I mentioned? Well, they made a reappearance all over the airplane's aisle. We're talking a massive puddle stretching from almost the middle of the plane to the front door. The smell was horrible, and since this was a small plane with only one exit, everyone behind us was trapped. The flight attendant's face went from smug to horrified in an instant. She stood there, mouth hanging open, as passengers started complaining about the mess. Some were gagging, others were yelling, and nobody could leave without stepping in it. One passenger loudly complained about how disgusting it was and demanded to know how they were supposed to get out. Another passenger shouted that they should have just let us through. They had to call in a hazmat team to clean up the mess. I watched from the terminal as they went up into the plane in their full protective gear. The flight attendant had to stay behind to supervise the cleanup, and I caught her looking at me with the most defeated look on her face. My dad later told me that he overheard the flight attendant getting chewed out by her supervisor for not following proper protocols when a passenger reports feeling sick. Apparently, the whole incident delayed several flights and cost the airline quite a bit of money, way more than it would have cost them to stock a few simple sick bags or let us through to the front of the plane. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.